Hello, welcome to Atheist Edge. I am Chris. I'm here today with Courtney.
Hi.
And today we are playing a little game called Name That Prophecy. This is where I will give our guest Courtney a biblical prophecy, and all I have to do is just yes, no, tell me whether it is about Jesus or whether it is not about Jesus.
I need alcohol for this.
Yes, there are no prizes except internet glory. So just want to set expectations right now.
All right.
So, first prophecy. Are you ready?
So these are prophecies just from the Bible?
These are prophecies from the Bible.
Okay.
Yes. This is, therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel.
Mm-hmm.
Is that about Jesus or not Jesus?
It sounds familiar about Jesus.
It is about Jesus. According to Matthew, that is about Jesus.
Okay.
Okay, next prophecy.
Well-
That is from Isaiah 7:14.
But he's not. Is he called Emmanuel?
He is, according to Matthew. That is totally about Jesus. That is why
So,
the virgin conceived and bare a son,
So-
specifically to fulfill that prophecy about Jesus.
so people called him Jesus, but also Emmanuel.
Ask Matthew. He's the one who's bringing up all this stuff.
All right. Okay.
So next prophecy. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted.
No idea.
That-
I'm gonna, about what's the question? Is if it's
Is it
about
Jesus or not Jesus?
Oh, I'd say not.
That is not Jesus. That is directly after the last prophecy
Uh-huh.
in Isaiah 7:15-16. But this is not about Jesus. This is about a child whose birth signals to King Ahaz that his coming war will soon come to an end. Okay, next up. Doing really well so far, by the way.
Yes.
Next prophecy, also from Matthew. Out of Egypt I called my son.
Not Jesus?
That is about Jesus. That is from Hosea 11:1. According to Matthew, that is why Jesus and his family had to flee to Egypt in the first place,
Oh.
to fulfill that prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
Next one up. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols.
Well, it's they, so it wouldn't be about Jesus.
That is correct. It's from Hosea 11:2, and it is
You-
about the nation of Israel.
You have really good comedic timing. You're like, no.
I'm asking Jim to talk to his son.
Oh, okay. All right. Just like dun dun dun. Yeah.
Yes.
What is that? Jeopardy music?
Yes. But you guys seem pretty quick, so we're
Sweet.
doing good here.
I can pause if you want.
Let's let the guest have a drink. Let's
It's like I'm sipping in between each one. It's ridiculous. Okay.
okay, next up. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey.
Sounds like Jesus.
Sounds like the triumphal entry, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where it comes from. It's from Zechariah 9:9, quoted by Matthew as the reason Jesus comes in on a donkey and everyone's all, yay, Jesus.
Yeah. If anybody knows Bo Burnham's earlier stuff, it's turned into a ridiculous joke.
Next up, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. He shall speak peace to the nations. His rule will be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth.
Jesus?
That is not Jesus. That is from Zechariah 9:10, but it's not about Jesus. It's about an earthly king who will one day take the throne in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last couple. From you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from ancient days.
Old from ancient days. Um, that sounds like Jesus too.
It is about Jesus. That is from Micah 5:2, quoted from Matthew as the reason that Jesus had to be born in Bethlehem.
Mm-hmm.
Also, probably the same, I don't know if he quotes it, but Luke also has Jesus being born in Bethlehem, probably for that same reason. And the last one, he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border.
Assyrian?
Assyrian.
Sounds more like Moses.
Well, it's not about Jesus, it's about a military leader who will come to deliver Israel from bondage.
So would that be kind of the argument of, or do we know who that's about?
I don't know specifically. I have to check a commentary on Micah probably, but the point I'm trying to make here is that there's all these prophecies in the Gospels about Jesus, and these are all pointed to as, well, how could one person have come and fulfilled all these prophecies? It's the odds of that are presented as some ridiculous exponents, and the idea is that there's no way that just a random person could fulfill this. It has to be God driving this. It has to be the genuine 100% true Messiah. But the problem with these prophecies is that you just need to look a verse after or a verse before, look at the context the verse is in, and it's not talking about Jesus at all. Jesus may have been born in Bethlehem, but he did not deliver Israelites from Assyria. They weren't under the control of Assyria at the time. And you can't say, out of Egypt I call my son, when clearly in the context he's talking about the nation of Israel as a whole. That's even half of the verse in Hosea. He specifically mentions Israel, and they're taking it out of that context to apply to Jesus. So what they're doing is they're taking these they're almost doing it in reverse. If you want to have a prophecy that's going to be really convincing, to say, okay, this had to have come from God. It has to be obviously applying towards what you were talking about now in the past. It has to be very specific and very clear.
Right.
But the way they're taking it, they're kind of looking at what's happening, and then they're applying it to these old verses.
Okay.
And if you want to do that, you can take literally anything and make it into a prophecy to make anyone that you want sound like a prophet. Like, I think that I could make a convincing argument that Shakespeare was the greatest prophet of his generation, just by looking at some of the stuff that he wrote in his plays.
Yeah.
For example, in The Tempest, he writes, "As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free," which normally isn't taken as a prophecy, but was he talking about something like The Pardon of Richard Nixon by Gerald Ford? If you want him to be a prophet, you can take it that way, and it makes as much sense as anything else. Or in Richard III, where he says, "Now is the winter of our discontent." Could that be about the frustration at Democrats at the inauguration of Donald Trump in January? It makes as much sense as anything else. Or women, or African Americans, or Hispanics, or we could run with that. But or how about this one in Hamlet? He says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Was he predicting the rise of modern cosmology, quantum mechanics, dark matter? I mean, this was written in 1601, and the first patents of the telescope were not made until 1608.
Can you repeat that one?
It says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy."
That seems like such an atheist thing to say.
I know. Maybe it's the first. Was Shakespeare the first atheist prophet?
Because I mean, because people talk about this a lot when you talk about the virtue of kind of the scientific worldview or the atheist perspective of the world being larger and more magnificent and amazing, and the truth of that, the truth of evolution, the truth of these things being so much more magnificent and incredible than than a biblical narrative, that, things didn't just pop into existence by magic. That's really simple, but things evolved over time, and there's this intricate, really beautiful, amazing process to it that's just so much cooler the more you look into it, and the more you know about it. It's really interesting. So yeah, I really love that quote.
Yeah, it's a cool
Because
quote.
that absolutely sounds like what I've said about a modern scientific worldview versus a religious one.
But the fun part about that is, the Bible will have a verse like the heavens declare the glory of God. So whereas, we might take, the wonders of outer space and the nebulas and supernovas and black holes and all the cool stuff there is out there, and we may look at it as nature as being cool just for the sake of observing nature, and all the weird new scientific questions it raises and all the stuff that we get to discover.
Right.
And Christians will look at the exact same stuff and they'll be like, this is God's glory.
Yes. Yeah.
The wonders of God's creation.
Right. And it's like they simplify it down, and they don't want to continue asking questions. They want to just say, oh, now we get it. And actually, Jim has these coasters that are Shakespearean quotes, and this one says, I was seeking for a fool when I found you, as I liked it. And I like that for Trump right now. Yeah, because to me, in the kind of the current political system, it's really certain people are benefiting from the lack of experience and the lack of drive of the current president, and so they're certainly appreciative of that there's like a puppet they can control. Anyway, away from politics.
But yes. Anyway, all this goes to say is that if you're approached by someone who is a Christian and want to take these, if they're pointing to these prophecies as evidence why you should believe, then you should be aware of where they're getting these prophecies from and the issues that they have with them. And if they're talking about Jesus, they should be clearly talking about Jesus and only Jesus.
Oh, so these are ones that are used to signify Jesus, even though they're not?
Yeah, okay, when I was big into Christian apologetics, you would find these lists of hundreds of prophecies, big and small, about the life of Jesus, and
to bolster the argument.
And you'd see things, and I don't remember the exact mathematics of it, but they'd say, okay, let's just take 8 of these prophecies. And it was always stuff like born in Bethlehem, riding on a donkey, born of a virgin. And if we just take these 8 key ones, and we take, okay, what are the odds of one person just randomly coming about who would fulfill them? Then they'd have some ridiculous odds, and they'd say, okay, either you want to, if you're going to be if you're a disbeliever or an atheist agnostic, you need to reckon with these incredibly small odds. And they'd say it makes more sense, given the odds, to believe rather than not believe. And the weird thing is, let's say we give them that, just hypothetically. You need to also be able to say, okay, the only way there's no other possible explanation for these prophecies getting fulfilled. But clearly the writers of the Gospels were aware of these prophecies. They had to be aware of them.
Yeah, I've heard that argument before.
To even think to include them.
Right.
Well, maybe they were aware of these prophecies about the Messiah. They wanted to portray Jesus as the Messiah. So they wove these things into their story where he fulfills all these prophecies. That is a much more, if you want to play the odds, that's a much more likely explanation than even supernatural causation.
Yeah, and that's a big thing. I've heard that argument a lot about cosmological arguments or other ones that are about the odds of us being here and the odds of this thing happening. But it's like they just completely disregard the much larger odds of it being some sort of supernatural source rather than a naturalistic one. And they talk about naturalism is just as much of an assumption as supernatural beliefs, and the problem I have with that is that throughout history, everything that we've ever learned about things that are mysterious, it turns out to not be magical. It turns out to not be um, supernatural. It turns out to be of the natural world, and able to be replicated, able to be studied. On it's a physical, tangible thing that we can all agree on, and so it's naturalism is a logical assumption over this idea of a supernatural mover that you would have to explain that much more about, and you have all your work ahead of you making it a supernatural explanation versus trying to figure out it in a naturalistic way.
Yeah, I mean, just think about going about your day, the number of weird stuff that can happen to you. Like if I lose my keys and they turn up in some random location in my house that doesn't even make sense. Like I find them like in my bathtub drain or something like
Oh wow.
that.
Yeah.
Not has ever happened to me, but like if I find them in some weird place, then I don't even know when I had my keys out in the bathroom or something like that.
Right.
Right. I think not even just my natural assumption, I think pretty much anyone's natural assumption would be a natural assumption.
Right.
It would not be, God must have put my keys in the bathtub.
Remind me to get Drano or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like just going about your day, you just don't jump to that conclusion.
Yeah.
You're willing to entertain some admittedly unlikely notions before you're going to go all the way to some supernatural.
Yes.
Not even God. Maybe there were key pixies that floated out of my pocket just to mess.
I knew over a long time ago who could see fairies. Yeah.
But that's kind of where believers have this kind of weird duality where they insist on supernatural explanations when it supports the cause they're trying to get across, but they don't take it all the way. Once you start bringing in supernatural explanations that you can never prove or disprove, then you need to start bringing them in everywhere, because if God's can interfere with the natural processes of things to raise someone from the dead, he could be messing with my satellite signal. He could be making weird weather patterns. He could be making this coin I flipped land on its edge. There's no mechanism for telling when that stops.
Yeah, and that was actually a big revelation for me in college, because I was taking one of my last semesters. I was in this capstone class for psychology that was going over the history of the science of psychology. And what really struck me was, even back in ancient philosophers and all the way over to today, we keep having these discussions about whether we should include supernatural ideas into our worldview or not, whether something fits within that. And every single time throughout history, way long ago, the argument of a naturalistic world that isn't affected by a supernatural power has to reign true, because what we know, the foundation of science, doesn't make sense if we put in the influence of supernatural, because what can be replicated and what can be relied upon to be consistent about the natural world can't stay that way if you have angels that can affect gravity or affect these things that are supposed to be natural laws. And it's such, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but basically, these way back in ancient philosophy, we had these arguments and these discussions about whether or not human beings can be studied as being of the natural world. And we had this with Descartes with, he maintained that the mind was still supernatural and supernaturally inspired because he lived in a time when it was just, not acceptable to completely get rid of supernatural altogether. But he made this argument, one of the first arguments that was made about the body being of the natural world. So we can learn something about our body because it's consistent. And if it were supernaturally, designed, and if it were this sort of divine entity, then we wouldn't be able to study it and rely on it as being consistent, because it would be always changing, or it could be because it's supernatural, it's magical. And so, we can't rely on it and learn from our body, learn from the natural world, if we can't depend on it being consistent and relying on these natural laws. And so, so much of our modern science, if you accept the scientific method and if you accept modern science, then you kind of have to give way to this assumption that has had to be made time and time again throughout human history to get to that point in science, that we can't rely on a supernatural worldview. And I think a lot of people don't really see that connection because it's not made. I think, on a large scale in the world, it benefits leaders to have religious followers, but if you really take it to the logical conclusion, that really struck me in my school, that that we've had this argument so often and so many times, Galileo and all these people, science wins and God loses, and that's, it's really compelling.
Yeah, the methodological naturalism. I mean, if you want to call that an assumption, I know a lot of anti-science believers will call that an assumption,
Yeah.
and call that what you want, but it's an assumption that has got us to where we are
Yes.
right now scientifically. And
Not only is it logical because it's happened, like 99% of the time, science wins, and probably 100% of the time so far, or we would have more solid evidence of religious teachings. But yeah, if we can call it an assumption, it's a sound assumption because it's consistent.
Yeah, and once you start allowing supernatural into scientific processes, then you have a whole lot of unanswerable questions. You can never know for sure if your experiments will replicate properly.
Yeah.
Even if you do them again, done it 1,000 times again, and do them tomorrow, God could decide to mess with you.
Absolutely.
Or you have no idea if the rates of radioactive decay have been consistent through the years, because
exactly the
God
point.
could have changed everything. You have last Thursdayism, where God could have created the entire universe just now, and we would have no idea. And it's
if you're studying gravity and an angel, supersedes that, or if you are, a mathematician and God just decides to make 5 + 5 = 3, then it doesn't hold water in the world that we see around us and in the world that we have created as a society, and and it just isn't true.
Yeah, it's the whole problem with the presuppositionalists who want to say that, okay, you have your logic and reason, but you can't have those without God being a foundation of it. Like, okay, if you want to say that God is the foundation of logic, then God can change logic at his whim, and then everything becomes fundamentally absurd.
Yeah, and if you start with the assumption that God is the creator of everything we know, then that would follow. That's the assumption that religious people make, and that's another thing that's, I don't think, is really driven home with people, is that Christianity isn't as old as human history. That, the Adam and Eve story, people assume that the Judeo-Christian God has been around since the very first people, and it absolutely hasn't. It is not that old, and there are religions that are older, and there were, so many people that believed in completely different things, and it's just not, the world isn't the way that religious people think it is, and I feel like that's really damaging, for one thing. But it's such a different way of looking at the world. But I think these arguments that you and I talk about, I don't think most people have been confronted with, because I certainly didn't think about it when I was a religious person, and you don't make these really difficult arguments and decisions about what you believe and why you believe it until you're confronted with it. Otherwise you're just kind of in this echo chamber of going to church every Sunday, and you never have to think about these things, and you never are confronted with it unless you go to science majors in college, which is what I did, and here I am. So
Yeah, it's not an easy question, going from, your comfort zone where you think you have a book with answers to everything to having to come up with a whole new paradigm to filter the world through. It's not an easy question, and I get why people don't really want to do it. They just
yeah,
want to go with what they know.
and there's multiple things that hold up people's faiths. And it's really scary if you feel like your self-identity and your morality and your life purpose and all of this stuff and your future up beyond your life and your life plan and your loves and all of these things are tied into your religious belief, then there's a lot at stake to question, and you just sometimes you just don't.
God has sent this dog to interfere with our broadcasts.
Oh yes. Exactly. There's so much around believers that reconfirms their belief, but it's just because they see it through that lens. And once you step outside of that, the world and knowledge and freedom really opens up.
So, long story short, in summation, science is cool. Prophecy is bogus. Keep watching Atheist Edge.